Hello, and welcome to Inside Plan Fort Collins. I'm Kelly DiMartino. Plan Fort Collins is a community visioning project that's been going on for a year, and we're here today with some guests to talk specifically about how that project is going. I'd like to introduce Kathleen Brackey, who is the Director of Transportation Planning. Kathleen, welcome.
Great, thank you.
Jeremy Klopp, who is with Fair and Peers, and Jeremy, you are one of the consultants helping us with this project. Welcome.
Thanks.
And Joe Frank, Advanced Planning Director, who is kind of the master in charge of this whole project. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So as we start our program, Joe, if you could give us just a quick glance at what Plan Fort Collins is all about and just a little bit of overview into what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, Plan Fort Collins, there's sort of two major parts to it. One is to update City Plan, which is our comprehensive plan, which contains the principles and policies for the growth and development of the community. And the other part of it is the Transportation Master Plan, which is about transportation and different types of bikes and cars and pedestrians, and also includes them where streets are located and the types of streets. So this is a major policy effort that we do every few years, and this is a major update to both of those documents.
All right, so it's a project that's been underway for several months now. Today we want to focus specifically on that transportation element and the Transportation Master Plan. So Kathleen, I'm going to ask you to start by giving us just an overview of what the Transportation Master Plan, or what we'll call TMP at times perhaps, what that entails and why people should care.
Okay, great. The Transportation Master Plan is, as Joe said, a very important element of our city's master planning effort. So we will be looking at, from a system-wide perspective, what are the policies that will be guiding our transportation system over the short-term and long-term future. The Transportation Master Plan includes all modes of travel, so walking, biking, transit, driving, how we use our transportation system for commerce and moving trucks and goods and services. So it's very broad in terms of all of the areas that are encompassed in the Transportation Master Plan. And then there's specific elements of the Transportation Master Plan that we're focusing on with this effort as well, and that includes the update to the Master Street Plan, the Multimodal Capital Improvement Plan, and the city's pedestrian plan. So there's a lot of pieces in the works right now, and a big effort.
So as we start to kind of tackle those pieces a little bit, talk about what that looks like. Like when we say we're doing a plan, you know, Jeremy, your group is involved. Tell us what we're trying to actually accomplish.
Well, I think we're trying to accomplish a number of things, but the way that we've been getting at that with the folks who've been participating is to present some choices and to really think about how the city could develop and change over time for transportation and mobility. And we presented some of those key choices over the summer this year and got some good input from the public. And what we're hearing is that the adopted long-term vision for transportation is still something that's very important to residents of Fort Collins. And we're moving ahead with a number of those plans that are already adopted, like the Transfort Strategic Plan and the Bike Master Plan. Kathleen mentioned some of the areas where we are looking at more comprehensive updates, and each of those areas we're looking at ideas and actions that might help address some of the changing character of the needs of the population for mobility and some of the things that are changing outside of Fort Collins in terms of our ability to provide transportation services for residents.
So you mentioned support for an existing vision. For people who may not be familiar with all of our plans and policies that we have in place, because let's face it, we have a lot of plans and policies, help people understand what is kind of that current vision and maybe some of the things that have been reaffirmed through this process.
Well, I think to start with, our vision is basically a transportation network that includes streets that carry all modes of travel. So whether someone is driving, biking, walking, we really have that complete streets policy. So rather than a street that's only for cars and another street that's only for bikes, let's say, our long-term vision and policy basis is really having that complete streets approach. And then having streets within the network that are designed for different purposes. So for example, we're familiar, most people are familiar with College Avenue as our major arterial north-south through the community, but that's supported by a network network of other arterial streets that run east and west and north and south. And then we have a more refined network of collector streets or local streets within the city system. So that type of framework for our transportation street system and complete streets is part of that long-term vision that people are saying they continue to support. A healthy transit network that can get people easily and conveniently from point A to point B through the system is something people are still very connected with. And also a very workable bike and pedestrian network is very important to people. I'd say areas that we're hearing more emphasis on, or new areas for this particular plan, are how do we look at linking our local transportation system in with the region? How do we look at new types of vehicles and alternatives that may be coming forward? That's a real new area for this particular plan. Lots of other ideas about reshaping some of our existing streets. How do we gain as much efficiency and maximize the capacity of our existing street network? That's a theme that we're hearing a lot about as well. And certainly the integration of all the modes, that we're not separating how the streets work for cars and transit and bikes and pedestrians, but how does all of it work together as a system and as a network? So. And interesting, I think those other trends about how our population's changing over time. We have an aging demographic. How do we look at the long-term future of transportation needs for people as they get older? So a lot of affirmation of the current long-term vision, but also a lot of new ideas as well.
And I think one of the unique aspects that's really influenced both the Plan for Collins process is within the 25-year time frame that we're dealing with, is that we'll be building out our growth management area there. We're going to run out of vacant greenfield areas, vacant lands. And so a lot of the emphasis in this planning process has been to look toward infill and redevelopment. And that's, I think, has some interesting implications not only for land use, but also for transportation. And
I think especially in the context of the master street plan and thinking about the long-term vision for each of the streets in Fort Collins, I think one of the new things in this effort is a shift in thinking that we really have designated the maximum network that is likely needed for that 25-year future, and that the emphasis is really going to be on using the streets that we have designated most efficiently to get the maximum capacity, as you mentioned, and doing that in really established areas. I think the College Corridor and the Mason Corridor are great examples of trying to really look at how to maximize the ability to move people and to provide walking and biking and transit opportunities that are convenient, as well as maintaining vehicular mobility for people driving. Those are challenging kind of conversations to have, but we see that becoming more and more the type of conversation that we'll have as Fort Collins matures.
As the average citizen, how might things look different, or what does that mean in terms of the trade-offs we might be making?
Sure.
Well, we have a few examples over time. It really falls into that category of reshaping existing streets. That's one example. For example, if people remember Mountain Avenue or Remington Street, in the past they were 4-lane streets that carried 4 lanes of traffic, 2 in each direction, and they've been reshaped over the years to carry 1 lane of traffic in each direction, but provide for a center turn lane, bike lanes, and on-street parking. So it's a way of gaining more use for more types of travel within an existing street, rather than having to widen the street to add that type of capacity. So more recent examples include Laurel Street along the north side of Colorado State University. And another project that's kind of at the drawing board stage right now is LaPorte Avenue between Wood Streets and House, and looking to see if that could be a good candidate for reshaping, where instead of 4 lanes of travel, there would be 1 lane in each direction. Again, that center turn lane, and then bike lanes and on-street parking. So it's a way to not only increase capacity for more travel options, but also to increase safety by providing the center turn lane. That's a good safety improvement, and it also helps provide traffic mitigation for the adjacent neighborhoods. So it's a way to accommodate multiple benefits out of an existing street without having to continually widen or rebuild a street. So it really falls in that area of more efficient use of our existing system.
We hear on our citizen surveys, and certainly that mobility is something that's important to people, and that always comes up as a priority. So as we're looking at our entire system, I'm just curious how this concept of streets fits in. I think people's initial reaction is like, build more roads. That way you have more capacity. But as I'm listening to you, it seems like that doesn't automatically mean more capacity, that there are other things in terms of how the streets are designed, how it fits with your bikes and your transit. I'm just curious, maybe Jeremy, from your perspective of what you see in other places that works really well that we have in place here, or where we're headed that we think is going to get us in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things when we look around at other communities that Fort Collins is doing particularly well and that we see a lot of support for continuing to do. And one of those areas is really maximizing the signal operations and sort of the intersection capacity, so that when you are waiting at an intersection and you are waiting at that red light, that we're managing the technology serving all of that traffic at that location as efficiently as possible. And you've got a great system here that you've continued to invest in since your last Transportation Master Plan, and that we're recommending you would continue to do along those lines. The second area I think that Fort Collins is really well known for is the high-quality trail system that you have that serves as almost a secondary network to what we typically think of as streets being very important to mobility. But you have a great both recreational trail system, but it also functions really well for commuting traffic. And it connects many of your activity centers and your employment centers and Old Town, and with the Mason Corridor project, a great north-south connection that really ties a lot of that together and connects to the region. So one of the things we're talking about, as Kathleen mentioned, is what's the best use of those trails for a wide variety of people who are comfortable riding with young kids, or maybe older folks who aren't typically using those for a trip to the store. Are there things we can do to make that last connection from maybe where you live to that trail network more convenient, safer, easier to get to, so that becomes a more regular and available choice?
Maybe just to add on to that too, in terms of our street network, the other piece of information we've been gathering from the community is for more flexibility in our street design. We currently work from the Larimer County Urban Area Street Standards, which I know is a really long term, but that sets the design criteria for each of our streets, whether it's a 2-lane arterial or 4-lane or 6-lane. But what we've been hearing a lot of interest in more context-sensitive solutions for our street design, so that our streets are more part of helping to create the place in our community, rather than just a physical way to get from point A to point B. But how does our street system and how they're designed not only provide the mobility and safety that people want, but how does it link to the land use in that particular area, and how does it help foster the goals for infill and redevelopment? So I think this has been a really important part of our work on the Transportation Master Plan on the street side, is how do we start looking for more integration in our street design and land use planning and urban streetscapes and things like that. So I think it's been a really valuable part of the community dialogue, and we would like to come forward with recommendations to help provide more flexibility.
I think when we talk about context-sensitive design, it sounds a little bit like a term of art, but really if you take College as an example, College Avenue, despite the fact that we don't have those standards in place, College is very different in Old Town with diagonal parking and enhanced crossings with curb extensions and median refuge islands, and it's very different along campus and as you go further south into the Midtown commercial area and Harmony. And if you think about how that design changes for College, that's what we're talking about, is having maybe some new tools available to have that happen more regularly through the design standards. And so that we can treat those streets differently when the land use and the infill and redevelopment objectives are better served by maybe a different design that's better for pedestrians or for parking, and how we treat some of those things and the specifics of the design for the street.
So when we started this process, that was one of the things we talked about, I know, is how these integrate together, and that we were hoping to see that really close integration. What are some of the other things about this time around that you are seeing that are different than perhaps what we've done in past process? processes, both with Transportation Master Plan and also with the overall effort, Joe?
I can talk about the transportation side, but I think it really emulates the overall perspective for Plan Fort Collins, and that's certainly where we're taking the lead from, is that as we're developing the updated policies and recommendations from the Transportation Master Plan, we're doing it in a more collaborative manner, bringing in multiple disciplines so that it's not just transportation departments or staff or consulting team, but it's how do we have a more interdisciplinary approach. So for example, including land use planning, utilities, stormwater, a whole host of natural resources, a whole host of participants on our transportation sub-team for the Transportation Master Plan. And I think that's been really healthy to have that dialogue, and so that we're not just making decisions purely based on the technical transportation data, but how are we including data and input and feedback from all of those different departments from throughout the city and from the consulting team. So I think that's been helpful. And then how do we look at whether it's the Master Street Plan or the Multimodal Capital Improvement Plan, how do we look at a decision-making process that's more, that takes into consideration the triple bottom line approach, meaning, so we're addressing environmental and economic and human factors in that analysis. And it's not, again, not just our transportation, but we're adding to the transportation analysis to make sure that we are including all of those other considerations. And I think it's really helping us come up with more holistic recommendations and a holistic analysis process. So, but Joe?
Well, we've been going through an extensive public process to get people's opinions on where we're headed in transportation and land use. And I think one of the interesting things is people are generally very comfortable with the direction, and they're saying there's a lot of good planning has taken place, let's not lose that, and let's carry a lot of that forward. So I think we're going to be doing that, and in fact, in a lot of the areas that we've been doing very well, we're going to take it to new levels. I think some of the new areas of coordination that an emphasis is one is in the economy. The city plan is about 10 years old, and the economy was considered in there, but I think today with the current economic climate, jobs and retail and how we're going to compete in the region for jobs and for sales tax, and it's very important. So that's sort of a new area of emphasis is in jobs. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm running for Senate. I will bring jobs. But it is a big emphasis. I think some of the other areas that we heard a lot about is people who are very interested in is health and wellness. And I think that's becoming an important factor for people moving into communities or looking at bikeways and health hospitals and access to medical services. And I think trying to think about the future of Fort Collins and how we can encourage more of a healthy community is a big area too. I think the third area is the coordination with utilities. The utilities are now sort of reinventing themselves, looking toward the 21st century, and the whole area of storm drainage and energy and water is changing so rapidly that and those utilities are really thinking on in the future that there was a big opportunity to coordinate all of that with land use, with transportation, and I think that's a big new emphasis in this plan too, and a lot of exciting parts of it. You might want to talk about the link between energy and transportation, which is an interesting area.
Do you want to?
Sure. Well, there are a number of links between energy and transportation, both in terms of the outcomes, but also in terms of the cost to an average household for transportation. One of the new ideas in this plan is to be thinking more broadly about how much it costs an average family to get around or an average household to move around Fort Collins. And that has a lot to do with how much energy it takes to do that, and that has a lot to do with some of the environmental outcomes of those transportation choices. So part of the way we've been talking about that is to make those choices easier and more convenient for people. So whether they be healthy choices or whether they be choices that require less energy and accordingly less cost to provide, one of our objectives and one of the changes in our vision statement this year is really to try and make those types of choices easier for people to make. And the energy benefits can be really significant, as well as some of the environmental outcomes in terms of air quality and emissions. In most cities, and Fort Collins is not alone, nearly 30% of the air emissions that are associated with climate outcomes are related to transportation. So those choices have a fairly significant impact on those things. And the energy that we use to move around, whether it's for commercial activity or our day-to-day choices for how we get around, have a direct connection to that.
So as we're talking about this plan, I just want to kind of clarify for people, the policy of, hey, we want to make those choices easier for people is at this level in the transportation plan. And then the next step after a plan is adopted is into, okay, now we actually move into implementing and making those things available. Can you just talk a little bit about how that works?
Sure, and I think that's a really important message because it's not just about creating the planning document. And especially, none of us want to see a plan that just sits on the shelf. We want to see it implemented over time so that we are making progress toward those very important goals that we have set for the long-term future for our community. So as part of Plan Fort Collins and as part of the Transportation Master Plan, we are developing a list of action items. And some will be immediate that would come forward for recommendation with plan adoption in early 2011. Others might be say near-term type action items, maybe in the 1 to 2 year time frame. An example we were talking about earlier, an update to the Larimer County Urban Area Street Standards. That would be an example of something we could take a look at that might take a little bit longer time than we have between now and early 11. So we'd like to make a recommendation for that type of near-term strategy. And then also look at longer-term strategy, say from the 3 to 5 year window. What should be the action steps that we're taking during that period? Again, to keep that momentum going and ensure that we're continuing to make progress towards those long-term goals. So I think the action items and implementation strategies are very important. And in addition to that will be performance measures. So how do we gauge our progress over time? Because again, it's not just about setting out on that course, but how do we know we're actually staying on course and we're making progress, or do we need to make course corrections over time? Now, Joe mentioned the change in the economy that we faced over the last several years. There may be other factors that change over the next 5 years. So how do we be flexible so that we can gauge our progress over time and make adjustments as we need to? So that implementation is very, very important. So.
Great. And that applies not just to the transportation master plan side, but the overall effort, I assume.
No, and I think that's one of the, Kathleen mentioned a couple of the big differences between this plan and previous plans. One is the implementation and an emphasis on how we're going to get there. And then the other one is measuring that trip, and are we succeeding? Are we accomplishing what we said we would accomplish? So the metrics. I think that the whole metric part of this is a much bigger factor than has been in any of the plans.
Right. So before we want to run out of time, I want to touch briefly on, we've talked about streets, we've talked about bikes, we've talked a little bit about transit. We haven't talked a lot about pedestrians, and that's part of this plan as well as the pedestrian plan. Could you just talk a little bit about what goes into pedestrian plan and kind of some of the themes maybe we've been hearing from people in that area?
Sure, we can kind of jointly do this. I'll start. We've been hearing a lot of interest in the pedestrian plan and areas of improvement. A lot of acknowledgement that our first pedestrian plan was done in 1996, and so it's been quite a while since we've updated this, but we've accomplished a lot since 1996, and that we do have a better pedestrian network today than we've had in the past, or better design standards for pedestrians. But we still have a long way to go. And one of the particular areas is that linkage. How do we get better pedestrian connections between different destinations and neighborhoods and transit, for example, or as Jeremy mentioned, the trail system? Because an isolated transportation corridor doesn't do you very much good if you can't get there. So that interconnect between our our overall transportation network and the walkability. Also the health and wellness, that's been a really important part of the update to the pedestrian plan, hearing that. And again, the changing demographics, a lot more people are interested in walking. People are walking for exercise, they're walking for transportation. They're trying to make that linkage to transit. And really, how do we look at pedestrian improvements for the most vulnerable people in our population? Our children in terms of walking to school, our elderly in terms of walking to services or walking to transit. And if we can start to address what are the walkability needs and safety needs of our most vulnerable population, then we can certainly help provide better facilities for people, who are, say, more in the middle. But the other aspect, real quick, is on the pedestrian plan, updating our pedestrian priority districts. Again, that map was originally done in the mid-90s, and we have a lot more activity centers now, a lot more schools, neighborhoods,
Can
parks.
I just, for a second, for people who don't know what activity
Yeah.
center
Yeah,
means,
sorry.
what does that mean?
That's a really good question. Sorry, too much jargon in our daily
You
lives,
planner.
so-
No, all these planner terms.
put out this whole glossary next to me. But an activity center is really an example, I think, would be like downtown, an area where you have a lot of different uses, a lot of different civic and business and educational aspects all going on together. And so,
Okay.
how do we, that's a great question. And it can be on a larger scale like downtown, or it could be more on the neighborhood scale where you have a grocery store and services that are close within your neighborhood area. So it's not just a large activity center, but there's big ones and little ones. But how do we provide better linkages to those activity centers for pedestrians? So updating some of the mapping and the walkability demand maps. So a lot of technical analysis as well as the policies.
But it's
Great.
an important area. I think walkable equals high quality of life for a lot of people, especially as you get older or if you're a person with disabilities. These things are very important to what can I walk to from my house? And there are even internet tools available. We're doing some technical tools to figure out how walkable is your neighborhood. And we're finding just in the industry across the country that there's a newfound interest in picking areas that are located with a lot of things around that you could get to by walking. And for some people that's because they don't own a car or they choose not to own a car, but for many people, a third of Americans today, they don't have the choice to drive, either because of their age as young kids or elderly or their disability situation. And I think for part of the hallmark of Fort Collins to date has been that this is a great place to live, in part because you do have great walkable neighborhoods already, and a big part of the PED master plan will be to reinforce those things and make sure that we're supporting those with the actions that we come in that plan as well.
Great, thank you. So as we wrap up, we've talked a little bit about the technical analysis, and oftentimes throughout this conversation we've said we, as we do this, as we do that. The we is not just staff and consulting team. This project is really about the community and
Absolutely.
the collective we in terms of our community vision. So in the next 90 seconds, Joe, can you maybe just talk a little bit about that public opportunity for people to connect into the plan?
Sure. We just in mid-October completed some public open houses to get input on the principles and policies, and we introduced some of the implementation actions to the public. Got very thoughtful feedback on that. In mid-November, we'll be producing the first sort of draft plans. The transportation master plan and the city plan and the PED plan, the master street plan, and we'll be walking that through city council. We've got 3 work sessions scheduled for the rest of the year. We'll be going into boards and commissions. We are planning a public, and sort of conceptually, a public event in December to present the document, get feedback. And of course, we're really encouraging people to go to the project website, fcgov.com, Plan Fort Collins. And if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, do, because that's the best place to get information. You'll be able to download all those documents. And of course, we're open and have been going out to civic groups and business groups and environmental groups, anyone who'd want us. And of course, you can call the Advanced Planning Department too if you want to talk to a planner about the project. So we're about halfway through, So it's going to get very, very busy, and lots of opportunities for people to get involved in the next 6 months.
All right. That concludes this edition of Inside Plan Fort Collins. For more information, please do go to our project website, fcgov.com/Plan Fort Collins. Thanks for joining us.